Hello and welcome to this Sofema Aviation Services three-part course on the Introduction to EASA Regulations for Initial and Continuing Airworthiness. We will be looking at Parts 21J and G, Part 145 Maintenance, Part M and Part CAMO. The objective of this short course of video-based instruction is to provide an introduction an overview of the EASA regulations which contain the implementing rules for regulatory areas related to design, production, maintenance, and continuing airworthiness management. The instruction covers the basic structure and content of the following regulations. Regulations 2018/1139, the basic regulation for aviation. Regulation 748/2012, the initial airworthiness requirements of Part 21J and Part 21G. Regulation 1321/2014, the continuing airworthiness requirements found in Parts 145, Part M and Part CAMO. We'll commence with an introduction to the general EASA regulatory environment and the basic regulation EC 2018/1139. We'll start by looking at the role of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. Today's aviation regulations have a high degree of commonality across all countries, and this is largely because of the work done by ICAO over the last, nearly 80 years. ICAO is a specialist agency located in Montreal in Canada and was established under the Chicago Convention, which was a landmark agreement in 1945, just after the Second World War, with the intent of establishing safe and orderly introduction of civil air transport and aviation activities across the world. The intent was that aviation regulation should be established on the basis of opportunity and operated soundly, safely, and economically. ICAO's core mandate is to help independent states or signatories to achieve the highest possible degree of uniformity in civil aviation regulations, the standards, procedures, and organizations. It has enacted this through the development of a number of annexes which contain over 12,000 international standards and recommended practices, or SARPs, all of which have been agreed by consensus by ICAO's now 193 member states, and they form the basis of global aviation regulation. So here we have the annexes. There are altogether 19. Annex 1 deals with personnel licensing, such as flight crew licensing. Rules of the air, obviously essential to have those common across the world. Meteorological services, aeronautical charts formats. Annex 5 is units of measurements in air and ground ops, standardization of those. Annex 6 relates to the operation of aircraft. Annex 7 is about standardizing aircraft nationality and registration markings. Annex 8, which we'll be concerned with in this series of lectures, deals with the airworthiness of aircraft, both initial and continuing. Annex 9 is facilitation. Annex 10 deals with aeronautical telecommunications, such as radio, air traffic services, Annex 11, and so it goes down through to Annex 19, which is the most recent of the annexes, and that was introduced in 2013 for safety management systems, and that has been one of the most major changes in the ICAO SARPs in the last 30 years. The SARPs, as developed by ICAO, are turned into conventions and articles which mandate their adoption. So the adoption of the SARPs practices from ICAO is enabled in the contracting states via the regulators, via EASA, FAA, and other national regulators. So the recommended practices form the basis of aviation laws and regulations in all of the contracting states across the world. The implementation of that is performed by the national aviation authorities in each country, and the oversight is from both ICAO and the national authorities. So This is how we achieve standardization of general aviation regulatory practices across the globe. It originates with ICAO and is passed down to the individual aviation authorities around the world to turn into laws through their individual systems. EASA. EASA's been in existence since 2003, and it took over regulation in Europe from that date from the JAA, the Joint Airworthiness Authority, and started its work in 2003, working from basically Brussels, which is the head of the European Union, and then moved to Cologne in Germany 20 years ago, in late 2004, and it's taken over the responsibility for regulating airworthiness and maintenance issues within all of the EU member states. This shows the countries regulated under the EASA system of regulations. There are 27 member states. There used to be 28, but the UK came out under Brexit. So we've got 27 member states, each of which have one representative member in the EASA board and have one vote in its decision making. The other body associated with lawmaking in Europe is the European Commission, which has 2 members from each member state, and therefore 2 votes. So the functions of EASA are managed under a management board, which brings together representatives from those member states, and also observer countries, which are countries that are not actually part of the European Union, but they're got a stake in following the regulation system for aviation in Europe. Also involved are the EASA Stakeholder Advisory Board, with its members drawn primarily from the aviation industry, manufacturers, maintenance companies, etc. And these parties, they take place as observers in the rulemaking process. The European Commission is actually the body that develops and adopts the high-level aviation regulations, but it does so with assistance from EASA, which is the industry expert, so to speak, in Europe. The EASA Management Board meets on a regular basis, and it takes its decisions in support of the key principle and goal of ensuring aviation safety and environmental protection in Europe. And the decisions taken by the EASA Board are regularly published on EASA's website. Decision-making at European Union level involves various European institutions. In particular, the European Parliament, which represents the EU citizens and is in fact directly elected by them. The European Council, which consists of the heads of state or governments of the EU member states. And the European Commission, which represents the interest of the EU as a whole. The European Council defines the general political direction and the priorities of the EU, but it does not exercise any legislative functions. Generally, it's the European Commission that proposes and develops new laws, including aviation laws, and it's the European Parliament and European Council that adopt them into law. Essentially, they are adopting a set of essential requirements specifying the objectives to be met by the legislation. So the European Commission then adopts what are known as implementing rules for achieving these high-level objectives. And this is what we call the detailed regulations. So the European Commission is responsible for implementing regulations in the member states, which reflect the essential intent of the higher level laws, the legislative acts passed down from the European Parliament and Council. Now, the primary responsibility for implementing the EU laws lies with the EU countries, and they can, in fact, do that through their own laws. However, in areas where uniform conditions for implementation of the law are needed, such as finance and tax, agriculture, the internal European market, food safety, and to a large degree aviation, the European Commission adopts an implementing act. An implementing act means that the Commission must implement legal instruments, which are regulations, directives, etc., which exactly reflect the content intent of the higher level legislative act with no deviations. Where it is not necessary to ensure absolutely uniform application of the legislative act across all member states, a delegated act can be adopted by the EU Commission. With delegated acts, the Commission has some power to make amendments or add supplements to the higher level law to provide flexibility or to optimise its implementation. Effectively, the EU Parliament has delegated the responsibility for enacting the intent of the particular legislative act down to the Commission and hence to Member States. However, this does have strict limits, and the delegated act cannot change the essential elements of the law passed by the Parliament, and the legislative act must define the objectives, content, scope and duration of the delegation of power. The implementation of EU aviation legislation has moved to some degree in recent years towards delegated acts, although I'd say that 95% of the legislation related to aviation is in fact an implemented act, which means it has to be copied exactly across all the member states and followed to the letter. The basic regulation for aviation. Now, EASA's legal powers derive from this regulation. The basic regulation, which is originally was EC number 216/2008. But now the current regulation, as amended in 2018, is EC 2018-1139. That represents the latest thinking and objectives of aviation regulation in Europe. So this amended basic regulation, the latest version, defines the agency's roles and responsibilities and establish common rules in the field of aviation. Now, EASA undertakes its role. What it does, it undertakes its role in regulation through the application of a wide range of provisions which expand upon and interpret the requirements of this basic regulation, which you can call the mother or parent regulation for aviation, in a manner that provides sufficient technical detail and guidance to be applicable. The enforcement of the regulations are put in place by the European Commission, supported by EASA, and indeed the national aviation authorities of each of the member states. So what does Basic Regulation 2018-1139 cover? Well, everything including design, production, maintenance and operation of aircraft in EU territory, as well as the operational infrastructure such as aerodromes, air traffic control and air navigation systems. So all those things. Operation of aircraft in and out of EU territory, design, production and operation of safety-related aerodrome equipment and support of aerodromes, including safeguarding of their surroundings. This is a quick high-level overview of the European regulatory structure. The Basic Regulation 1139 derives, as we said earlier, from the ICAO SARPs. So it adopts all of the regulations, or rather recommendations, coming out of the 19 annexes of ICAO. Secondly, the regulation includes the European Union's own objectives for aviation safety and efficiency, and that is derived from a plan for aviation safety, but there's also economic considerations as well. So underneath the basic regulations, we have the sort of four functional groups of aviation there. Airworthiness, which we're mostly concerned with in this set of instruction, and that includes the regulation of initial airworthiness and the regulation for continuing airworthiness. Also flight standards, things like aircrew, which covers training and licensing and medical aspects, regulation of air operations, and so it goes on. There is a number of different categories there, but as I said, we're going to be focusing on airworthiness in this course. The basic regulation as amended in 2018, provides the common rules for civil aviation, and it's based upon a risk-based and operation-centric approach to legislate for aviation safety. Its objectives as a regulation are to provide a high uniform level of civil aviation safety throughout Europe, to focus European safety action resources on addressing the highest safety risks, to reduce risk levels by excellent communication across the states and the direct involvement in decision-making of those states, and collaboration of resources across the EU to be efficient. So there we have it. EASA aims to be a performance-driven regulatory agency operating at quite a high level, and it's focused on refining and standardizing regulation in those areas which it sees to have the most influence on aviation safety and economic benefit for the EU. So coming out of that is a decision from EASA to now delegate more of the routine regulatory functions, such as licensing and approving organizations, to the member state national aviation authorities. And this frees up EASA's resources to support its high-level aims. So there we have it. In summary, delivering better governance, making better use of limited resources. It should be a flexible and performance-based system regulation, and to patch up any gaps and inconsistencies in existing laws. Some of the changes progressively being introduced are if they haven't already been introduced, are the creation of a pan-European pool of aviation inspectors, meaning that inspectors from any country in Europe can participate in inspection activities across other states, thereby making good use of skilled resources. Framework for transferring responsibilities, oversight mechanisms, a central database for collecting all the certified persons and organizations together in one source of data, and in generally improved working at the international level. So on a European level, in the context of EPAS, which is the European Plan for Aviation Safety, the intent of the EASA is to be proactive and when it comes to safety. To look ahead, identify persistent or emerging risks in aviation, and put in place safety actions to deal with them, and then track the results to see if they're effective. So the main objectives and priorities of EPAS under EASA are closely aligned with the goals of improving aviation safety and environmental sustainability. So the plan identifies specific safety risks and outlines actions to mitigate those risks through regulatory changes, oversight activities, and safety promotion efforts. For example, enhancing operational safety, including efforts to reduce runway excursions, loss of control in flight events, and mid-air collisions. Improving organizational safety by strengthening safety management systems, or SMS, across the industry. That's a very high-profile item for EASA. Enhancing oversight capabilities of organizations and promoting a safety culture within those organizations. Also addressing emerging threats such as cybersecurity threats to critical aviation infrastructure, and the safe integration of drones into shared aerospace. Environmental sustainability. EPAS also incorporates objectives related to reducing aviation's environmental footprint, focusing on noise reduction, lowering emissions, and promoting sustainable aviation fuels. So the EPAS has quite a wide-ranging remit and set of projects, but I would say that the focus is largely on safety and on design and certification activities. In fact, this is reflected by this is a chart which shows the activities, or rather actions, that have been put into the European Plan for Aviation Safety. Something like 180 action items. And 51 of those are related to implementing effective safety management systems in organizations. So that's a very big and important theme for EASA. The second highest number of project actions are design and production related, sustaining high levels of certification, compliance, and dealing with new technologies. So the overall strategic theme for EPAS during its review period of 3 years is to focus on a safe, secure, sustainable and resilient aviation system, which is capable of coping with disruptive events of any type. I mean, we've learned quite a bit from the pandemic a few years back, and it was good to see that during the pandemic, the EU's aviation safety system maintained a high safety record. It wasn't impacted really anyway by the problems brought about by COVID on the world supply chain and on people's communication and many other factors. So what is the role of EASA? Well, you can break it down into about 4 things, really. There's rulemaking. So that's drafting amendments to the high-level basic regulation, and also the implementing rules at a lower level below that regulation. EASA also drafts and adopts what we call soft law, which is certification specifications, AMCs, acceptable means of compliance, and guidance material. The second most important function of EASA is certification management or oversight. The issue of design approvals for modifications under type certificate and supplemental type certificate systems. The issue of organisation approvals for design organisations and production organisations. Issue maintenance organisation approvals, MOA, and also POA for non-European states, and continued oversights of those certificates of approval. On the certification side, EASA checks all European Union products for their airworthiness, including their operational suitability and their environmental performance against technical standards and requirements. For any new product, a certification team is established in EASA, and they start their work by familiarising themselves with the product design. The applicable technical standards and requirements are determined, and a certification program is agreed. The compliance is demonstrated by the approved design organisation and checked by the EASA certification team according to the agreed certification program. So ultimately, the EASA team issues a final report and issues a certificate for the design only if the product passes all technical requirements and if no unsafe feature has been detected. So European rules and oversight mechanisms, including the maintenance of products, ensure that the initial levels of safety from a design and from a type certificate are maintained throughout the product's life. The 2 principles which you might say operate in EASA are the central role of the type certificate holder for owning the airworthiness of their products throughout their life cycle. Secondly, the delegation of compliance verification to approved organisations. Unlike the FAA system, EASA has gone to a system where there is a high level of delegation and trust, if you like, in approved organisations to carry out the functions of verifying approval to the airworthiness standards. Standardisation is another element of the EASA's role, ensuring that the rules are implemented equally and fully across all the member states. And they also report back to the European Commission. It is actually the European Commission's role to ensure that all member states implement the EASA rules, or the implementing rules as they're called. But it does rely on EASA to act as a monitor on this and report back to the Commission what's going on in each of the countries. EASA also forms a centre of expertise on aviation regulation and operations in the EU, and it has a function to manage international relationships, developing harmonised rules for regulations, for example, between the major regulators, between, say, the US and Europe. Also, to put in place mechanisms for accepting certificates and aircrew licenses from other countries that are not in the EU. The national airworthiness authorities in the EU states also have a role to play in the regulation of aviation in Europe. Their function is to do some of the things that the EASA used to do, such as issue certificates, airworthiness certificates, C of A, etc., noise certificates, approve and issue certificates for organisations such as Part M, Part 145, which is maintenance, Part 147 training, and Part 66 engineer licensing. Issue production organisation approvals and also Part 21 approvals. And these are done following a strict set of rules laid down by EASA. So our EASA has delegated to the NAAs the responsibility for making sure that any organisation that sets itself up in Europe to do maintenance or design or continuous airworthiness management is following those regulations. The NAAs also help provide expertise for future EASA rulemaking and certification activities. And overall, they have a responsibility. Each of the NAAs has a responsibility to ensure that the requirements for airworthiness, product design, organisation approval, and also personnel licensing are followed within the member states. So you can see here that multiple parties are stakeholders in the aviation regulatory and safety framework in Europe. When a new set of aviation legislation is brought into official EU law, this is done by the European Parliament and Council. The European Commission is the politically independent executive arm of the EU, which proposes and adopts changes to aviation legislation following a rulemaking procedure in which EASA provides the proposed implementing rules based on aviation safety objectives and the data gathered from industry. The IRs, or implementing rules, are the rules implemented to enable the essential requirements of the basic regulation for aviation. EASA develops the detailed technical rules, oversees the adoptions of the regulations by industry, such as operators, manufacturers, and maintenance organisations, and provides an overarching safety management function under the European Plan for Aviation Safety, which includes the collection of data about safety concerns. The whole EASA regulatory system is based on monitoring safety performance and then making recommendations, they're called opinions, to the EC, the European Commission, for regulatory changes, where these changes will improve safety and/or efficiency. The national aviation authorities of individual EU states, which are called the competent authorities by EASA, have certain responsibilities to establish the frameworks for approval and oversight of aviation organisations operating on their territory in accordance with the common EASA requirements, not their own. So member states cannot issue their own aviation rules. They can't deviate at all from the EU rules, nor can they make any other arrangements with other countries regarding aviation regulations. Industry at the lower level, that's the operators, airlines and maintenance organisations, etc., are required to comply with the established regulations and also provide feedback on their operational safety to both their NAAs and to EASA. And also the NAAs and the operators and industry do participate in developing aviation regulations. In fact, EASA's working method is to be totally transparent about this, about the adoption of opinions, which is opinion being a recommendation to change a regulation, and also in their development of acceptable means of compliance and guidance material within the regulations. So if they're making any changes, they publish them and get input from the industry and from the wider community of aviation in Europe. So these transparent procedures ensure that the right people are involved. We get the expertise focused on developing the regulations. There's adequate consultation and feedback, and each member state in the EU has the right to be associated with the adoption process. There's also special procedures that allow the agency to take more direct and immediate action in the case of emerging safety problems. So similar, transparent procedures also apply in the case of individual decisions. So it's a democratic and open process, which enables everybody to fully transparently see what's going on in terms of the development of aviation legislation. The develop of opinions, as I said, being recommendations for change by EASA, involve a lot of stakeholders. There's some of them here on this diagram. Obviously, each of the European Union countries, national aviation authorities, ICAO itself, inputs from the objectives of the European Aviation Safety Plan, safety recommendations coming out of any safety studies, also input from the national aviation authorities of countries that are not in the European Union, and so on. So there's quite a wide community of stakeholders involved in the development of opinions or regulations. This is the process followed. This flowchart shows a sequence of actions when EASA adopts a new safety recommendation involving consultation with industry stakeholders. So it starts off with the concept of a rulemaking program, initiate the task for the new rules, consult various stakeholders and bodies in the formulation of that initial idea, and develop terms of reference. And then this is analysed and turned into an RIA, which is a regulatory impact assessment. A draft rule is then drafted up and it's circulated amongst the public and the industry for their comments and inputs. It's circulated as an NPA, which is a notice of proposed amendment. And that contains explanatory note, what impact it will have on the current regulations, what the draft proposal is, what the proposed changes are, and a check against the ICAO high-level recommendations as well. So it may propose a new rule altogether, or amending an existing regulation, and or perhaps generating a new acceptable means of compliance and guidance material. A CRD, which is a common response document, is a list or table of all of the EASA's responses to all of the comments it received during the MPA process. So the industry stakeholders provide their input. That's all gathered together, so it's captured in the CRD. And ultimately, this results in EASA generating, from all this information, EASA puts together an opinion, which is the final proposal to the European Commission for implementing rules. So at the end of the rulemaking process, EASA have developed a rule that reflects some serious study and a lot of input from other people. So we've got some buy-in there on the regulation. It's not, as I said before, it's a transparent process, which ensures that it's going to work in practice and it's going to be adopted successfully. So in the EASA system, there's a hierarchy of rules. The basic regulation sets the scene, which activities are covered, who what requires a certificate, and contains high-level safety objectives, which are called essential requirements. Beneath the essential requirements of the basic regulation, there are detailed implementing rules, IRs, which we just generally call the EASA regulations, but technically they're called the implementing rules. In addition to this, EASA is responsible for drawing up non-binding advisory material, the so-called soft law, which is it's semi-applicable as a law in the sense that if you want to certify your product or get your organization approved, you really do need to comply with these acceptable means of compliance or these certification standards, CS. So this is a simple model of the different regulatory levels, starting at the top with this hierarchy. Starting at the top, there's the basic regulation, which sets the scene, which is the parent regulation for all aviation activity regulation in Europe. The agency opinions are developed for that, the recommendations coming out of EASA, and they're submitted to the European Parliament and Council, turned into a law, becomes a binding law. And then we go down another level where the European Commission is responsible for developing the more detailed regulations, the implementing rules, again with agency opinion or recommendations. And right underneath that is the soft law I mentioned, which is the standards to be followed and the guidance material. And again, that's called an agency decision because they're responsible for issuing it themselves. It's not it's non-binding, it's not law, so the agency can actually issue that stuff itself without going back to the European legislative system. This is a more detailed illustration of the same thing, really. So we have at the top the Basic Regulation 1139/2018, the parent law for aviation, Basic Regulation. And underneath that, there's a number of annexes which contain all of the essential requirements, the ERs, everything we want to achieve in each of the aviation areas in terms of control and safety. The level below that are the implementing rules, which are the more detailed regulations. Again, these are binding in law, and they specify the actual processes for things like design, production, ops, and services. So we've got the objectives at the high level, and we've got the processes and the way you're supposed to do it at the implementing rule level. Implementing rules apply to processes. They also apply to organizations. OR here is organizational requirements, what industry has to do to comply. And also the authorities, the national aviation authorities, have a set of regulations they've got to follow. That's the AR, authority requirements, which relate to their oversight of these organizations in their country. Advisory material, AMC, acceptable means of compliance, which is one possible way to comply, but it usually is the only way to comply in practice. Certification standards, or CS, which relate to technical design requirements in the main, and GM, which are guidance material or general explanations of the regulations. So as we said, the implementing rules are legally binding on the organisations and on the national aviation authorities, and the EU member states can't add any additional requirements. Now, it is possible that operators and design organisations can develop alternate means to comply with the requirements of an implementing rule, apart from the published AMCs. So there is a process to do that. It's called alternate means of compliance, and it would have to be the organisation seeking to comply with the regulation by a different means would have to give some pretty good justification why it would provide an equivalent level of safety and control. So it's actually quite difficult to do in practice, and it's really easier to try and comply with the published AMCs. So this is the actual structure of the basic regulation, 1139, and it contains the high-level aviation law. The 9 annexes underneath it contain the essential requirements, which must be complied with for each of these specific areas of aviation regulation. Other regulations within each annex contain the detailed implementing rules, or more commonly we call them the EASA Regulations. And as said on the previous slides, both ERs and IRs are binding in law, and you've got to comply with them. So there we have it, the 9 annexes in the basic regulation and the covering regulation itself, which has 6 chapters. We'll go through those now. So structure of the basic regulation, chapter 1 are the principles of the regulation, and objectives, which is to improve performance in the aviation sector, provide a level playing field in the European market for aviation, promote free trade by air and cost efficiency, provide a uniform level of environmental protection, promote research into aviation, and to provide a safe aviation environment. Also to assist member states in exercising their rights in fulfilling their obligations under the Chicago Convention by ensuring a common interpretation and a uniform and timely implementation of its provisions. So the SARPs developed by ICAO are interpreted in a single way under the basic regulation, which prevents individual countries, interpret them slightly differently and therefore having different aviation regulations. So EASA performs that standardization function of defining the principles of operation and the essential requirements. Chapter 2, Aviation Safety Management, stems from ICAO's Annex 19 requirements. And this is the European and state safety programs. Each member state shall, in consultation with all the relevant stakeholders, establish and maintain a state safety program, or SSP, for the management of civil aviation safety in relation to the aviation activities under its responsibility. This is called the State Safety Program. The State Safety Program shall include at least the elements related to state safety management responsibility as described in the ICAO 19 Annex and recommended practices. EASA shall also maintain a European plan for aviation safety as described earlier. Chapter 3 is the substantive requirements. So these are the detailed or rather top-level requirements for the regulation and management of aviation in each of these activity areas: airworthiness and environment, aircrew, air ops, aerodromes and air traffic management and navigation systems, air traffic controllers, unmanned aircraft or drones, and third country operators. For example, the airworthiness and environmental section is where the basic requirements for the certification of aircraft and products and the approval of design and production organizations are stated. So in this section, the certification of aircraft and products is stated, including the issue of, or the requirement for the issue of a type certificate supported by operational suitability data. This chapter also establishes the requirement for design and production organizations to be approved and issued with the certificate. The requirements for personnel responsible for aircraft maintenance and indeed flying aircraft pilots to be approved and possess a license is also established in this section. The detailed essential requirements for airworthiness are in fact included in Annex 2 of the Basic Regulation, and the essential requirements for the other areas of aviation activity are detailed in other annexes. So there's quite a large number of annexes. Chapter 4 is about joint oversight and enforcement, and is where the basic requirements for delegating the responsibility for managing and overseeing the aviation regulations to the national airworthiness authorities in each EU member state. So these, the NAAs in each state are known as the competent authorities, competent in the sense of being able to enforce the regulations and have the knowledge and the oversight to do so. And this section requires the competent authorities to undertake such responsibilities as managing the certification of aviation operators, airlines and general aviation operators, and organizations in their state, including maintenance and production. Their responsibility is also the inspection and auditing of these organizations, issuing of licenses and certificates. So everything in accordance with the basic regulations, essential requirements. And this will include the oversight of flight operations, airworthiness, ATC, and the aerodromes in their countries. Chapter 5 is all about EASA. These are the high-level requirements for EASA, what its role and purpose is, the tasks that it carries out, responsibilities, methods, and how it's financed from the European Union. Chapter 6, final provisions. This is the legal statements about the powers delegated by the European Parliament to the European Commission to enable them to adopt aviation acts and implement regulations to ensure that the essential requirements of the basic regulation are both carried out and effective. The annexes, yes, there's quite a large number of those. There's 9. Each one of those relates to a specific area of aviation activity. And as maintainers and designers, we are most interested in Annex 2, airworthiness requirements. A new Annex 9 has been introduced in recent years to cover UAVs or drones. So what is the role of AMCs? Acceptable means of compliance, well, they're non-binding and they're known as soft law because The responsibility to ensure compliance sits with the national competent authority, who have the ability to vary the requirement. So the AMC serves as a means by which the requirements contained in the basic regulations and implementing rules can be met. So the AMC illustrate a means, but not the only means by which a requirement of an implementing rule can be met. So the means of compliance may be by the establishment of management systems and processes, by implementing controls, quality and oversight systems, by provision of operational data, or by carrying out a standard test, and numerous other methods depending on the nature of the activity being carried out and being regulated. So satisfactory compliance using an EASA published AMC is the way to facilitate certification tasks for the applicant and the competent authority, the NAA. However, NAA and the organisations in their states may propose an alternate means of complying with a particular regulation. They're called ALTMOCs, or alternative means of compliance, and they are really proposing an alternative to an existing AMC, maybe a variation on it, or a method of showing compliance by another method other than the process or test required in the existing AMC. However, if you're going to use an alternative means of compliance, you've got to justify it and come up with a very sound and thorough statement as to why it's as good as the existing AMC. So it is quite difficult to do. It's quite a challenge, but it can be done, particularly in regard to perhaps new technology where the existing regulations are not able to accommodate a new way of doing things in aviation, perhaps things like electric aircraft or composite structures, drones and so forth. There may be a need for alternate means of compliance when the regulations have not quite yet caught up with the technology evolution. What are certification specifications? Well, CS, they're non-binding technical standards adopted by EASA to meet the essential requirements of the basic regulation in regard to design in particular, or initial airworthiness. So they're the reference technical standards against which a design can be evaluated. So the CS specifications, CS25, are, for example, very similar to the US FAR 25 requirements because they've been harmonized across the two authorities. So it's mainly concerned with Part 21 CS. It's concerned with the certification of designs. And what we say is that if all the various aspects of the aircraft affected by the design, such as flight load, structural integrity, flammability, interiors, electrical power, system safety, and so on, if they all follow the requirements of the related CS standards, the design can be considered airworthy, and therefore it can be certified by EASA. So the CS standards have been developed over decades to represent the key things to be taken into account when you're designing an aircraft or a product. And we have basically, there's 5 groups of CS specs: CS27 specs, which relate to small helicopters, CS29 large helicopters, CS23 general aviation, light twin aircraft, etc., CS25 large aircraft and airliners, and another one for drones. So they've all got their specific design requirements for different types of aircraft. This is an example on a bit of a technical level here. This is an example of a certification standard for the design of an aircraft electrical system, CS25-1355. Not really going to get too much into electrical design here, but just illustrate the principle. This CS defines what electrical power distribution system is on an aircraft. And it states that for an aircraft that requires 2 sources of power generation for its certification, which will be the case for any two-engine aircraft, that if one source of electrical power fails, such as a generator, then it must be possible to automatically or manually switch to the other generation source. So this implies that both the electrical generation systems should be able to feed essential systems via a common bus. And you can see that there on that very much simplified aircraft electrical system diagram. However, the AMC further clarifies the requirement by stating that in order to achieve proper and reliable independence of the two electrical power sources, the protection and distribution system should be designed in such a way that a single fault, such as a short-circuited feeder or bus, will not disable the supply from both sources. So the AMC is basically an elaboration of the CS25 requirement, providing guidance as to how the design should be configured. So we say, yes, you must be able to maintain two independent sources of power, but watch out, because when you design this, you've got to make sure in doing that there is no one single fault that could cause you to lose the redundancy of having two systems. So really, the CS is a short and simple requirement in its statement. It's not a long design requirement, but if you read the AMC, it implies that there is actually more to it, and you're going to need to put in place a fairly complex set of protection devices, relay circuitry, and switching logic in order for this system to meet the requirement of independent electrical power. So that's a typical design type of CS, or they mostly relate to design, but obviously not just electrical power, aspects of structure, power plants, and every part of the aircraft. Guidance material, on the other hand, is a non-binding explanatory and interpretation material about how to read the regulations and how to achieve the requirements in those regulations, and also AMCs and CS. So it gives information and cites some examples to assist the user in developing a response to the basic regulation. Well, here's an example of some guidance material. This one is for Regulation 21 LA 229, which relates to unrepaired damage. So what we have here is the actual regulation says that if any unrepaired damage should be evaluated by a competent design organization to determine whether it has any impact on airworthiness and environmental compatibility, if that damage is not already covered by data that's been put out by the aircraft manufacturer. So that's clarified in the GM for the same regulation. And it says here, the process is not intended to supersede the normal maintenance practices defined by the declarant, such as carrying out actions to repair the structural damage, but it addresses specific cases not covered in the manufacturer's documentation. So in the blue there, 21L 229 is the statement of the requirement, the actual regulation. The GM there in the green is a clarification about what it's intended to do. So this is the purpose of guidance material. So this is an expansion of the previous diagram, the basic regulation, but narrowed down just to the areas dealing with airworthiness. So in respect of airworthiness for aircraft, we have two sub-regulations which sit underneath the basic regulation within Annex 2. One of them is 748/2012, and that relates to initial airworthiness or certification, or what we call Part 21. On the other side, relating to continuous airworthiness, is Regulation 1321/2014, and that contains something like about, I think there's 7 annexes there. Anyway, from Annex 1 through to 5D. So the ones we're concerned with in this series of instructions are Annex 1, which is Part M, Continuous Airworthiness Management, Part 145 in Annex 2 to this regulation, which is maintenance requirements, and Annex 5C, which relates to the approval of a CAMO organization, Continuous Airworthiness Management Organization. It's called Part CAMO. And underneath all that, specific to those regulations, they are the AMCs, acceptable means of compliance, and certification standards, as we discussed just now. That's the non-binding law. So to finish up, definition of airworthiness is defined in Annex 8, Part 1, and it's important to understand what an airworthy aircraft is. It is one which conforms to its type design and which is in a condition for safe operation. Those two things have to be concurrent before you have an airworthy aircraft. The aircraft must conform to its type design. So this is considered to be attained when the aircraft configuration, its configuration being all its components and elements. So its configuration and when the components installed are consistent with the drawings, specifications, and other data that are part of the type certificate, which includes any other supplemental type certificate or other approved alterations. So we take an aircraft, it originally was issued with a type certificate by the manufacturer. On top of that, there may be some modifications embodied as STCs or other alterations, and that defines what the configuration of the aircraft should be. So there's a lot of drawings and design data relating to that. So that's the type conforming to type design. The second thing is the aircraft being in the condition for safe operation, and that refers to the fact that the aircraft should not have degraded beyond the point at which it's airworthy, for example, due to skin corrosion, any kind of structural cracking, window delamination, or leaks, tyre wear. This is really the function of aircraft maintenance. So those two things together, conformity with the original design, all the parts and configurations of the aircraft are in line and agree with the original drawings and designs, and the condition is maintained. So those two things give us an airworthy aircraft. We're going to go on to look at in more detail at the requirements of initial airworthiness and of continuing airworthiness management in the next parts of this course. Meanwhile, I thank you for your attention on this particular module. Thank you.